smarter, more powerful English teachers. And with that in mind, it seems like an ideal time for me to pass on any useful knowledge or advice that I might have before I literally forget it all. But the tips, materials and personal examples featured in this video contain what I believe to be the most important or useful tips to anyone coming to Japan to teach English. So the first thing you'll be asked to do when you arrive is give your self-introduction class, known in Japanese as jibawi shoukai. It's really important as it's your first chance to make a good impression, and with 40 students in each class, that's 40 good impressions to make. And in your first month alone of teaching in Japan, you can expect to do this class at least 10 or 15 million times. And actually, over my 3 years, the way I dealt with this class changed quite a lot. Before, I used to go in with a television, lots of pictures and handouts for a quiz I would do, and there was usually a lot of preparation required. I'd spend maybe the first 30 minutes doing a presentation, using the pictures on the television, and talking about myself, my hometown, and British culture. Fish and chips and Voldemort? Yeah, British culture, innit? But the overall feel of this introduction class was very much like a structured presentation, it was like a monologue, and the focus was on, wow, it's a foreigner teaching in your school from a distant land. Many students had never met a foreigner before. But because of this style, I felt that when I left the class, I'd barely built a rapport with the students. I'd barely gotten to know what the class was like. By the end of my time as a teacher, the way I did this class had completely changed. I would literally just go in with a few printed pictures, some chalk, and a smile. Rather than tell them where I was from, I would get them to shout out some countries and guess my age as well, often with depressing results. 38 years old. Really? I cut down the opening presentation and got students to think up questions in pairs to ask, or to do their own self-introductions in English. And most importantly, because there was less structure, I was able to be less serious and more fun. And the way I knew that this less structured way of doing a jibawi shoukai class was better was that when I returned to the class, I was often welcomed with genuine applause and excitement, and students were actually enthusiastic about English class. So there are many ways you can tackle the jibawi shoukai class, but my advice is focus on building a rapport. Don't drone on and on about your family and your hometown, unless your hometown has a zoo or a spaceport. Don't be too serious, don't take too many materials, and try and be really happy, smiley and fun. And you'll do well.
Remember, win the crowd, and you will win your freedom.
And don't talk like that. It'll probably scare the children. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, do you need Japanese to be an English teacher in Japan? And the answer is no. As I've mentioned before, I came to Japan with no knowledge of Japanese. In between trying not to fail my degree and working almost full time, it wasn't possible for me to take classes, and I didn't have much luck finding a tutor in the run-up to coming here. At this point, many confused people will be asking,
teaching in Japan without knowing Japanese? Impossible.
The answer is nearly everyone teaching English in Japan is an ALT, or Assistant Language Teacher, working alongside a native Japanese teacher of English. They can explain the complex grammar, you can immerse the students in native speaker English, and the setup works quite well. Probably half of all teachers coming to Japan can't speak any Japanese, and some never even bother to learn when they do get here because it's not a job requirement. For me though, not knowing Japanese at work was a real problem when I first got here. I work in a school with over 1,000 students, and with one or two exceptions, no students can really communicate in English that well, particularly as it's not an academic school, and here in the countryside, English is often regarded as irrelevant, which in hindsight is probably why we have local bands with names like Brown Shit. And after months of furious study, in my first year I was able to speak and read basic Japanese. And it was then that the job became a lot more rewarding. First of all, I found students were a lot more willing to talk to me in English, in and out of the classroom, as it gave them a sense of comfort knowing we could revert back to Japanese. Better still, I could help students a lot more when it came to translating or correcting their work. And this transition from knowing nothing to being able to communicate with students was really rewarding, and not only helped with my relationships with students but also with teachers and colleagues as well. So by knowing Japanese, it made work parties and social events a lot more fun. So my advice is no, you don't need Japanese to teach English in Japan, but it will make your time here more fulfilling, and it will allow you to build better relationships with students and staff. And if, like me, before I came, you're having a nightmare trying to find a Japanese tutor or someone to practice speaking with, these days you can meet great Japanese tutors online. I've mentioned before I'm a fan of the site italki, with many awesome friendly conversation partners on who you can talk to. Naturally, there's no substitute to learning spoken Japanese than from a native Japanese speaker, and by doing it online it's far cheaper and more convenient than tracking down a Japanese person who's also an experienced tutor in your neighbourhood. If you are considering it, particularly to viewers living outside Japan, the folks at iTalki have kindly donated vouchers to anyone watching this video. Just visit the link below, and if you decide to book a class, you'll get your second one for free. It's pretty cool as it's something you can actually use, and if you do it, it will give you a good chance to practice speaking Japanese before you're here thrown in the deep end. I hope it helps. When you start work as a teacher, you'll probably notice lots of cultural differences and subtleties that you hadn't known about before or that no one's ever told you. Obviously everyone knows the major ones, like you take off your shoes and wear slippers indoors often. But I found I discovered 90% of these cultural differences simply from first-hand observation. You'll see something unusual and then go off to a bar after work and discuss it with other seemingly confused foreigners.
Slippers. Slippers?
And schools in particular can be quite different from the West. So my advice is to try and be observant at all times, as you'll find no one will explain these differences beforehand. So here are 3 examples. If you're caught napping in most classrooms of the world, the teacher will destroy you. But in Japan it's tolerated to a much greater degree. If you see a student napping in class, don't necessarily go over and harass them. Students in Japan don't get a great deal of sleep as they have lots of homework, club activities and chores and things to do at home, so be a bit cautious when waking them up. You don't know what their situation is. More often than not, when you ask a student a question, they'll turn to their neighbour to check the answer. And it can be frustrating when the answer's really easy, you know the student knows the answer, but they want to check it first with a neighbour, and so the whole class is sort of shut down for 10 or 15 seconds while we wait patiently. But as Japan is a highly collectivist culture, you'll find teachers actively encourage it in class, so don't fight it, go along with it. It just means you have to be more patient when getting that answer out of the student. You'll find you'll be complimented quite a lot in school, almost to an absurd degree. You'll be walking down the corridor and students will say kakui or kawaii or ikemen. You'll hear it in the classrooms, you'll hear it in the corridors. Just don't let it all go to your head. You're not cool, you're not good looking, you're just a rare foreigner. Also, at many social gatherings, you'll find yourself being complimented for 2 things in particular. Number 1 is Hajimemashite. Watashi wa Chris desu. Kori wa pen desu.
クリスすごい日本語上手だね。
And the second is
クリスすごい箸が上手。うまいよそれは。
try not to get too frustrated when this still happens after 2 years. When I came to Japan, one of the things that shocked me the most was how often I saw students play the game rock, paper, scissors, or as it's known in Japan, junken. I estimate every student in Japan probably does junken about 35 times a day, and there are genuine cultural reasons for this, namely to avoid confrontation with small trivial disputes, but also to avoid standing out. So in team activities in class, students will decide the leader usually by doing junken, because no one wants to stand out. They'll pass the decision over to fate. The main difference between rock, paper, scissors and junken is what you say as you play it. First, everyone holds out their fists and says "Saisho wa guu," and then just before revealing your hand, say "Junken pon," and on pon, show your hand. If it's a tie, you'll quickly say "Aiko desho" and try again, and keep continuing until someone wins. Honestly, master that and you've mastered the art of decision making in Japan. It's not just used for classroom disputes as well, it's used for literally everything. So make sure you know it. And who knows, perhaps one day the UN will adopt rock, paper, scissors to solve major geopolitical disputes. With potentially devastating consequences. And finally, don't forget about the bigger picture, about life outside of work. It's likely you'll be placed somewhere fairly rural, where there might not be many foreign people around, so you'll probably stand out a fair bit. And this has some pros and cons, mainly pros in my opinion. The pros are that you'll be given lots of opportunities to engage and get involved with the local community. In my case, I've taught English classes at the International Centre, I've helped run special events and taken part in 2 Japanese speech contests. And some of the most rewarding things I've done whilst in Japan have been outside of work by getting involved with the local community. I discovered the trick is to keep saying yes to things and opportunities that come up. Even if it puts you out of your comfort zone, just keep saying yes. I guess the bad point is that you stand out a fair bit. In my case, I'm one of about 10 Western people living in a town of 100,000 people, and of those 100,000 people I've taught 3,000 of them English over the last 3 years. So I'm always careful that whatever I do outside of work never gets back to school. At best, I've gone to a bar, then gone into work the next day, and some students in the class know I was out drinking because I was served by somebody's mum. But be aware that your actions and your reputation can travel quickly around town, so stay out of trouble. So 5 tips, I hope at least one of them was useful. If you've just started teaching, good luck. I hope your experience is as amazing as mine has been. If you are thinking about teaching, definitely do it. It's probably the best job in the world after fried chicken inspector. And as for me, I've been up all night, I feel pretty awful, and now I'm going to fly to Hiroshima to eat some biscuits. So that should be good. Anyway,